I just want to certainly let everyone be welcome. I'm going to make sure that everyone is muted during the session for the question and answer later on. Then we can have you unmuted and so on. If you have questions, please put them in the chat feature on the right, or you can hover over my name, and you can also send the question directly to me. I will make sure to compile the questions so that at the end, Gordon can speak to the questions that are there. I want to say a little bit about who Gordon is. Gordon T. Smith is president of Ambrose University in Calgary, Alberta, where he is also professor of systematic and spiritual theology. He's also a teaching fellow with Regent College, Vancouver. Gordon is ordained with the Christian and Missionary Alliance. He's the author of a number of publications, including the more recent Wisdom from Babylon, Leadership for the Church in a Secular Age, and the upcoming Holy Spirit, a Theological and Experiential Introduction. He's married, and together they have 2 adult sons, and today he will be sharing on the Christian mind. I was privileged to be able to hear Gordon at the SBC Leadership Conference, at least 2 of the 3 sessions. The one I wasn't able to be there, but I sure enjoyed Gordon's sessions. Obviously, he didn't see me because it was all via Zoom. Really, I want to welcome you, and I really am glad that you were able to join us for our gathering.
Thank you, Daryl. Delighted to be with you.
Okay.
Shall I proceed?
Yes, you can. I just letting you know, I will remind you about 10 minutes before the end of the session, just to make sure that that you're aware of the time in case you weren't. But other than that, go for it.
How will you be reminding me?
I'm not entirely certain myself. I know one other session someone just spoke in. That might be during the Q&A time anyway, so it should be fine.
I just wanted to know if I'm watching for nonverbals or verbal.
Oh, I can say. Yeah.
Do we invite people to turn on their cameras, or is that not the practice?
I would yes, definitely invite people. I would encourage everyone to turn their cameras on. I think it'd be much better that we can, certainly for you to be able to see people. I prefer that anyway. I assume they're able to.
Yeah, I understand that one of the qualification for this conference is that people have to be photogenic. So I presume then that was listed as a qualifier here. Okay.
Wow.
Okay, well, greetings, friends, and thank you, Daryl, for your introduction, and would love to know where everybody's located. I'm aware that one of the limitations of a conference such as this is that we're not together in person and greeting one another in the foyer or in the hallway before the sessions or between sessions. But one of the advantages, of course, is that we have people that can zoom in, pun intended, from everywhere, from remarkably diverse locations. So wherever you are, I offer the following observations, comments, considerations for your reflection, and I trust for your encouragement. As was mentioned by Daryl, I spoke recently at the Steinbeck Bible College Leadership Conference, and coming out of that, I gave 4 sessions there. Coming out of that, one of the sessions was on this same topic, and they asked me if they could give, if having recorded it, if they could show the recording. But I've been kind of revising and working on those reflections, and I got some good feedback from that session. So I thought, no, I'd like to give it again, but taking in account of the ways in which it's an iterative, it's an ongoing conversation, and I welcome very much your feedback, your interaction with me on this topic, either now during this session, or don't hesitate to drop me a note at my email address at Ambrose University, or my personal address, which is on my website. I'm going to be speaking on the Christian mind, and perhaps more particularly, I'm going to nuance this. The subtitle is Cultivating or Tending or Nurturing the Life of the Mind, the life of the Christian mind in particular. I speak to this topic, without doubt, I speak to it from a backdrop of my own evangelical, theological, and spiritual tradition that I have to acknowledge was deeply suspicious about the life of the mind. That is, when Mark Noll published his Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, I read it and I knew, hey, that fits my tribe. That fits my heritage. That fits the formation, the religious subculture in which I was raised. Very much an activistic religious subculture that viewed scholarship and the intellectual life as a threat, actually, both to the cultivation of an interior spirituality, the cultivation of the Christian life, that somehow piety and scholarship did not fit together, that devotion to Christ and scholarship did not fit together. And we viewed it as a threat to the activistic agenda that we were committed to. My parents were missionaries. I grew up in South America. Eventually, by the way, I became a missionary, my wife and I, with the Christian and Missionary Alliance in the Philippines. That was our world, a deeply activistic world, and we needed to get about the work. And when it came to education, it was as minimal as possible in order to do the job to which we were called. So it took some time, and I'm deeply grateful that as a young man, a university student at the University of Regina, attending a church just down the street where the preacher routinely disparaged the life of the mind and in a sense countered the university as a threat to all that was good and holy and worthwhile. I'm grateful that as a university student, I happened to stumble upon, although I think in retrospect it wasn't a stumbling, it was providential, Weymouth, Switzerland, where L'Abri had been established by Francis and Edith Schaeffer. And deeply grateful to that couple who welcomed university students such as myself to study, to learn, to think, and that is the key word, to think about the faith. That is, they helped me to see that the Christian, spiritual, and religious tradition, in actual fact, takes the life of the mind with great gravity, with great seriousness. This is stated so very well by Gerald Hughes when he writes in his book, God of Surprises. He writes the following: "The mark of true Christianity will be its intellectual vigor and its search for meaning in every aspect of life. That is why there has been an emphasis on scholarship and learning in the Christian tradition." That is what I get from the Schaeffers way back in my youth, and from Gerald Hughes. That's a book I read just last year. What I get from them is the assumption that to be mature in faith, hope, and love is to grow capacity to think Christianly, and that capacity to think Christianly will ultimately lead to growth in our capacity for wisdom. On the one hand, of course, this refers to an understanding of our faith, that we have an informed understanding of our Christian faith. But on the other hand, it's important to realize, as Henry Blameyers put it years ago, again published in the 60s and 70s, that the genius of a Christian mind is that Christian thinking is in contrast to secular thinking, wherein every aspect of life is approached thoughtfully. Every aspect of life is approached thoughtfully. And that the Christian mind is not just about the religious mind versus a secular mind. What Blameyers insisted on is that, to the contrary, it's possible to do Christian worship in a fundamentally secular way, and it's possible to do banking in a fundamentally Christian way. That is, that a Christian mind is about a thoughtful engagement in a way that is consistent with the Christian intellectual and spiritual tradition, in a way that informs every aspect of life, from worship to buying and selling. And that therefore the genius of the church is to equip all of God's people, regardless of their vocations, whether they're called into business or education or the arts, to do their work in a way that is informed by the Christian intellectual and spiritual tradition. What do we mean by a Christian mind? Well, of course, there's various ways in which we might approach that, but I find it helpful. And so I just offer the following to you. I find it helpful to think about it in terms of 5 words: transcendence, truth, reason, sin, love, and wisdom. Actually, 6 words. By transcendence, I mean this. And here's where, when we speak about a Christian mind, we speak about it in the face of secularity, that a Christian mind sees, recognizes, I should say, that there's another sphere of reality. That is, that this, of course, is consistent with all religious traditions, where we recognize there's more to reality than merely what we can see, touch, taste, and feel. We recognize that there is indeed a transcendent one. And for the Christian tradition, we affirm that there's a triune and personal God, Father, Son, and Spirit. And it is this perspective that actually leads us to worship. We worship because we are worshiping people, because we recognize that there's another sphere of reality. Secondly, truth. A Christian mind cultivates a love for truth and a commitment, a courage to name reality, recognizing that truth is foundational to all Christian flourishing, all human flourishing, I should say. And when you put the two together, transcendence and truth, what you recognize is that for the Christian intellectual and spiritual tradition, transcendence is the source of truth. That is, we recognize and affirm the priority of divine revelation. Evident for the Christian tradition, at least in the authority that we give to the scriptures. We recognize that truth finds expression, embodiment in the biblical text. Thirdly, sin. Unapologetically, the Christian mind is one that recognizes that all things have been created by God and that there's a fundamental goodness to creation, but also that the physical, tangible world in which we live and all of the reality that has been brought into being by God has now been shaped, formed, infused by the human predicament that we speak of as sin. That everything has been fragmented, that everything has been twisted, has been infected with a violation of the good, the noble, and the excellent. Thus, just as transcendence leads to worship, the recognition of sin leads to humility, repentance, and dependence on the grace of God. Fourthly, reason and discernment. A Christian mind cultivates a commitment to clear, logical, rational thinking, exemplified by the way in which the articulation of the gospel is found in Paul's letter to the Romans. You could say the whole letter to the Romans captures that Isaiah line, let us reason together. The Christian mind is unapologetically reason-able, and it is resolved then to cultivate the capacity to think clearly and to discern the good, the noble, the excellent, to make informed decisions about life, work, and mission. Fifthly, the Christian mind is infused with love. We realize that truth and understanding are not ends in themselves, but are a means by which we would live generous, compassionate service for our neighbor. From this perspective, the Christian mind leads to service. It leads not to a self-centered life, but a de-centered life, a life lived for God in love for the world. And finally, wisdom. A Christian mind leans into instruction, education, and learning, such that Christian values are highly informed by the work of teachers who foster growth in knowledge, which leads to wisdom. And from this perspective, a Christian mind is teachable. I can say unapologetically that this is why, under my leadership, at least at Ambrose University, we come back to this theme of wisdom again and again and again, convinced, as Bruce Waltke, former professor of Old Testament at Regent College, put it, that this is the goal of the Christian life, to pursue wisdom, to know wisdom. And that if you are not wise, as you grow older, you are a fool. Those are your options, foolishness or wisdom. And a Christian mind ultimately leads to wisdom. But this vision for the Christian mind is under threat. I'm not going to be so melodramatic as to say it is under threat like never before. Yet, what I'm impressed with in my world is that there are three threats to the cultivation of the Christian mind that it seems to me need to be named. 3 ways in which a thoughtful Christian faith is discounted and undervalued. Ironically, you might observe, when it is most crucially needed. I'm going to speak. Yes.
Your audio is quite scratchy. I'm not sure if I'm assuming you're using a webcam.
I am.
Yeah, so I don't know what I was thinking if a microphone isn't plugged in properly, but I'm assuming that's not the case. So, I mean, you can carry on. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you know of at your end. I mean, I can understand you. That's not a problem. It's just scratchy.
Daryl, maybe that's me.
I don't think your voice is like that. I've heard it before.
Maybe that's me. You know, that's very generous of you to think that you blame the technology. I do blame the technology for many things. But,
well, no, I'm convinced it's not your voice.
I hadn't thought of this one quite yet. I mean, I use this week probably every day. I had 4, 5, sometimes 6 Zoom calls. We still aren't doing anything in person, so I'm doing this all the time. And I'm sorry that if on this particular app or program it's coming through scratchy.
Yeah, so no, carry on. If there's nothing we can do about it, we'll just carry on. I know one other person is checking with our techie people just to find out, but sorry to disturb you, but carry on.
No, I'm keen to come through as clearly as I can. In fact, I often think that we should go for about 5 minutes and then check, is this working? Should I move to multi-call or should I continue? I'm always wanting to check those things. Okay, so I'll continue, Daryl?
Yes, just continue.
3 threats to the life of the mind. Again, I'm not saying that the life of the Christian mind is under threat like never before, but it does strike me that in our post-Christian secular age, when it is so crucial that we cultivate the life of the mind, for our churches, for our schools, that these threats need to be named and taken seriously. First of all, pragmatism. By pragmatism, I mean the reduction of the life of the mind to a very narrow outcome, and that is a job or a career or something that we insist needs to be accomplished, even in ministry, even in the life of the church. What I find in my day job right now as the president of a Christian university is that this pressure actually comes from 3 sides. Students, and often their parents, reinforce this, are concerned with their careers. They come out of high school obsessed with getting a job, a well-paying career that will give them a promotion that will ultimately lead to financial security. They do not view a university as a place to grow in wisdom, but as a place to land a great job. And the only value then for an education is that they get a job. The only value is that they have the right skills, you might say. Sociologists speak about this as credentialing, that study and education and learning is about being trained, having the skills to get a job done. This gets reinforced where I live by the province of Alberta. This is not an overstatement, but that the government of Alberta only, in a sense, evaluates higher education, and that's the world in which I live, Campus Alberta. They only evaluate a university to the degree that we create graduates who can contribute to the Alberta economy, ideally by this weekend. This is just an overwhelming pressure. It's just a constant pressure from the government of Alberta. We want job-ready applicants. And when I say we're cultivating virtue, we're cultivating character, we're cultivating wisdom, it just blows right past them. Except, I also get this from the church. That is, even our denominational leaders, especially for our theology students in our seminary and in our undergraduate school of ministry, they want people who have the capacities to grow and cultivate churches. And of course, I'm not for a moment questioning the need for skills or competencies or being credentialed for a profession or for leadership in the church. All universities should be vibrant communities where good work is celebrated and where students are being equipped to discern their vocation and enter into a lifetime of fruitful service, of course. But rather, in this regard, my concern is twofold. that we have too narrow a definition of what it means to contribute to either the economy or the life of the church. And second, that we fail young people when we do not equally give them the capacity to think critically, think imaginatively, to grow in, to cultivate emotional and moral intelligence, and, as I said, to grow in the capacity for wisdom. Secondly, the second threat I see is sentimentalism. I'm not sure if there's a better word for this, and if you have a better word, I welcome the feedback. But this is to highlight the craving for emotional experience that bypasses intellectual engagement. That is depth of emotion without a corresponding engagement of the mind. Jonathan Edwards, perhaps the greatest of all American theologians, spoke of this as dangerous, spiritually dangerous. That is the desire for experience that is not rooted in depth of understanding. The genius of his British counterpart, John Wesley, was precisely the integration of head and heart, of mind and affection. This is the proclivity, whether in the church or in society at large, but in my own world, I see it more in the church, is to pursue experience, heightened emotional experience without reference to critical thought. We see this in our desires for speakers who want to inspire us, but don't inform us. In fact, I was asked a couple of years ago to speak at an event, and they made it very clear, Mr. Smith, we would like inspiration, not information. And I was just dumbfounded. What do you mean? You want, as my son would put it, you want hype. I guess that's what you want. You want hype. But who wants hype? It doesn't actually ultimately lead to transformation. That is the longing for this kind of inspiration through exciting stories that does not engage the mind, fails to realize that sentiments are fleeting and superficial. Depth of affection requires, back to Jonathan Edwards, depth of thought. Now, just as pragmatism is actually a half-truth, we want to equip people for the work to which they are called. Here too, I say, there's a half-truth. That is, that in actual fact, the genius of the Psalms, for example, is the integration of head and heart, understanding, and the ordering of the affections. It's not that I'm discounting what is happening to us emotionally. As I said, in a little aside there, I want to cultivate the emotional life of the students that come to the university. And on Sunday morning when we worship, we engage the whole person, head and heart. But my point here is to say, when we try to engage the heart, that is not an informed experience of what is happening to us emotionally. It flies in the face of the biblical witness and the witness of our evangelical heritage. Sentimentalism is the propensity to discount the importance of the life of the mind as something that is integral to genuine religious or spiritual experience. Thirdly, a third threat is what you might speak of as partisan propaganda. My colleague at Ambrose University, Joel Thiessen, perhaps known to some of you because he's emerging as really a very gifted sociologist. He speaks of it as partisan reductionism. And these next words are a quote from him. He writes, "Partisan reductionism is a set of ideas or beliefs, often economic or political in nature, that serve as a simple, one or two variable, all-encompassing theoretical prism by which one sees, analyzes, and behaves in the world, almost to the exclusion or the shaming of other more complex, nuanced, and even competing frameworks." All of that is just his kind of sociologist way of saying, you believe what you want to believe, and you only then read those people, those voices, those perspectives that reinforce the views that you already have. And thus the media or journalism becomes nothing more than a means for disseminating an ideological agenda rather than fostering true understanding. In this approach, church teaching is just then indoctrination. We just want young people to believe what their parents believed. and opposing views are demonized. Critical thought and discussion is discouraged and viewed as a threat, whether it's to denominational leadership or to political leaders. And thus we have people on one end of the political spectrum only reading those voices that reinforce their views at that end of the political spectrum. We have public broadcasters or private broadcasters that only reinforce one ideological agenda. And so we only, in a sense, cater to that perspective, that view. And whether or not the facts reinforce that view is not the point. The point is, I'm going to believe what my party believes. I'm going to believe what my tribe, perhaps I use the word tribe better than party, because that assumes a political party, my tribe, my ideological view. If you begin to challenge that view, you view it as not compliant, not a team player, not a threat. I am not here too. I am not for a moment saying that we do not affirm a theological, intellectual, or even an ideological perspective, whether it's Calvinist, Wesleyan, Catholic, Orthodox, or Mennonite. Nor am I saying that those of a particular ideological persuasion, whether they are inclined to the left or to the right politically, that they shouldn't make the case for their position. Of course, I'm not for a moment saying that. What I am challenging is the propensity in our day to polarize, to dismiss critical discussion, to assume that the prevailing assumption of a particular tribe cannot and should not be challenged. Perhaps there are more threats, but at the very least, I see these three threats to a Christian mind. Pragmatism, or another word there is instrumentalism, sentimentalism, or just emotionalism, or partisan propaganda. That is, just believing what my tribe wants me to believe. And all three are current threats to the life and work of both the church and the schools and universities, and to the society at large. And it seems to me that the challenge of these threats is complicated by two things. The one is, to use a phrase from W.H. Auden, the great English poet, we live in an age of anxiety. That is, an age of fear. And fear keeps us from thinking critically, thoughtfully, and carefully. And second, we live in what some have called an age of distraction. That is, social media keeps us from doing anything that can be characterized as deep thought. And my concern is that it seems to me that evangelicals, and I'm pointing to myself, not pointing to others, but those of us within the evangelical theological and spiritual tradition that have not been strong on this point. As I mentioned in my opening comments, my own heritage dismissed the life of the mind, makes us doubly vulnerable to pragmatism, sentimentalism, and partisan propaganda. Therefore, it seems to me, we need to be particularly, in a sense, intentional to cultivate the life of the mind. And doing so means that we cultivate, I suggest, four things: the capacity for critical, confident, creative, and compassionate thinking. Critical, confident, creative, compassionate. And you know, I think this way as a university president. I say to our students, incoming students this fall, they will hear me say these words to them. While you're a student at Ambrose University, we're going to help you cultivate your capacity for critical, confident, creative, compassionate thinking. And yet, this is not just an academic agenda. What I want to press for is that this is what happens within our churches, within our faith communities, that when we develop our people, when we foster Christian discipleship, we are fostering the capacity of women and men in every walk of life, whether they're called into business, into education, or the arts, to cultivate the capacity for critical, confident, creative, and compassionate thinking. By critical, I do not mean judgmental. Rather, I mean the capacity to see clearly, to cultivate the capacity for discernment, to not be swayed by emotional appeals. to refuse to be gullible, to be able to challenge one's own biases and prejudices, to have no patience with hype or sentimentality, to follow social media, sure, but do so in a way that is critical, that is astute, that is discerning. Secondly, by confident, I mean not arrogance, but rather the capacity of young people and of all of us actually to come to our own conclusions, to be able to speak and have our own mind about a matter, to be able to debate around the dining room table, to cultivate one's own capacity to share an opinion and to enter into a conversation or a debate. People used to tease Joella and myself when they visited us that the dining room table was a boisterous place, and your sons don't hesitate to challenge you. And I say, yeah, I know they don't, but that's part. There's an agenda here. We're trying to urge them to think for themselves. That does not mean arrogant. It means you cultivate your capacity to have voice, and that applies then when you go into the business world or the world of the arts or the world of education to speak for yourself. Thirdly, to cultivate creative thinking. And by that, I mean the capacity for innovation and adaptability. That a Christian mind is one that is marked by an active imagination. This dimension of a Christian mind is, as often as not, cultivated by fiction, poetry, drama, music, and the visual arts. And it's the artists in our midst who are crucial to the cultivation of the Christian mind as much as any scholar or intellectual leader. Thoughtful Christians move comfortably from the library to the art museum, from an evening with their book club debating to a performance of a string quartet, because they're able to innovate and adapt in the life, work, and ministry to which they're called. And then finally, dear people, surely as important as any, is that a Christian mind is a compassionate mind. By that, I mean the capacity for empathy. Compassionate thinking is de-centered thinking, where we step out of our own shoes, our own situation, our own perspective, and see the world through the eyes of another. For those of us that have worked in intercultural ministry, we're doing this all the time. As I mentioned, I grew up in Ecuador, and Ecuador is a tiny country, but my parents at different times were serving in the Amazonian jungles, amongst the people of the Andes and the coastal plains. And in fact, all of my high school years were in Guayaquil, Ecuador. And often my parents would comment on, if you're in the Amazonian jungle, they see things this way compared to the people in the Andes, compared to the people on the coastal plain. That is, they were different cultures, you might say. They see things differently. And a compassionate mind is one that can stand in the perspective of the other. That does not mean that truth is all relative. It's just that we're able to see the situation through the lens of another person's experience. And as often as not, it's seen reality through the lens, through the experience of those that are less fortunate. On our campus, we have Derek Cook, who heads the Canadian Poverty Institute that is housed on our institutional platform. And I so appreciate that he regularly wants to remind our students, try to see the world through the lens of the homeless person, the addict. That is, to see it from the perspective of another person. What it does is it cultivates compassion. Being intentional, then, in our cultivation of the life of the mind fosters our capacity, critical, confident, creative, compassionate thinking, cultivate our capacity to resist, or at least not succumb to, the threats of pragmatism, sentimentalism, and partisan propaganda. How do we do this? How do we cultivate the life of the mind? Well, I can think of three things that we need to do by way, and I'll speak of these as spiritual practices. One is, of course, good teaching. Your thoughtfulness is only as significant, as deep as who you are, who your teachers are. That is, I often want to know, who are your mentors? Who are your teachers? That is, as much as anything, who has shaped, formed, and informed the life of your mind. Secondly, good conversation. Who are your conversation partners? And are they fueling your capacity for critical, confident, creative, compassionate thinking? And where I'm going to emphasize most in these remarks is, who are you reading? Now, I don't need you to come onto a Zoom call like this and very intentionally put your camera behind you. You know, two of you have, I see, your bookcases behind you. I am duly impressed. For all I know, you've just created a false backdrop. So I am not impressed. This is done yesterday. Yeah, I'm on a Zoom call with the board of Ambrose University, and one of the board members has the Trinity Library in Dublin behind him. Yes, I know. I am not impressed. So we tease them a little bit by that. Come on, show us your actual library, not kind of the ancient library of Dublin. But it is a fair question. And when I visit with pastors who are within our kind of orbit, who there's no doubt I'm visiting with them in part because I want them to think nice, warm thoughts about Ambrose University, and I want them to send their high school kids to Ambrose. So yeah, no, they know why I'm there. I'm not just kind of coming by to get a good cup of coffee. But when they step out and go down the hall to get us both a cup of coffee and bring it back to their office, I look around. I say, I want to show, who are you reading? Who are the authors, the teachers, the writers that are informing your thinking? And I want to ask this of all of your people. Who are they reading? Who are they reading? Not just who are their teachers, not just who are their conversation partners, both of those, that is teaching, learning as spiritual practice, conversation as spiritual practice, but who are you reading as spiritual practice? Read widely. Read older books. In his delightful and powerful introduction to an ancient book, St. Athanasius on the Incarnation, C.S. Lewis makes an appeal. He says that, yes, of course, we're going to read new books, new publications that represent the best thinking of our generation. And I, of course, hope that you will read new books. I'm an author, I'm a writer. I hope you're not just reading older books. And yet, what he also urges us to do, he says, at least for every new book you read an older book. As Lewis notes, older books have stood the test of time. They anchor us in the ancient conversation about faith, about the implications of faith, about wisdom, about living and working well. And his rule of thumb is that regardless of which books one is reading, ideally, never allow yourself to read one new book without reading an older one in between. That's a good rule of thumb. As a Christian, you might start with the Confessions of St. Augustine. You might discover an ancient voice from within your own tradition as a source of wisdom or encouragement. Do not be shy to read voices from the Middle Ages. I am personally deeply indebted to A.W. Tozer, who in 1963 published his remarkable collection entitled The Christian Book of Mystical Verse. And for me, growing up within my evangelical tradition, the mystics were somebody that you did not assuredly read. And here was A.W. Tozer, a pastor within my own tradition, suggesting that we read such voices. Eventually, it led me to Teresa of Avila, Ignatius Loyola, John of the Cross, three Spanish mystics who have been hugely influential in my life. Up till then, only reading the Northern Reformers, Calvin, Luther, Simons, and so on, but now suddenly reading the Southern Reformers of the 16th century, it revolutionized my understanding of the 16th century. And I'm so grateful to Tozer urging me to read these older voices. Secondly, not only read older voices, but also read history. Take, for example, and I just mentioned this as one example, but a crucial one, it seems to me, Margaret Macmillan, perhaps the premier historian of our generation here in Canada. Her book on the First World War, 1919, it is a combination of social, political analysis that explains so much of the world that we are in now, a century later. That is, it has become a go-to book for me on the history of the First World War, but it's her analysis of what came out of that in 1919 that has been so informative for me. That's not the only source, but it's just an example of what I mean. But also read social commentary, political analysis. For example, the works of Malcolm Gladwell, again, another Canadian. We read on faith, we read on belief, we read on doctrine. We join a book club that meets weekly, or pardon me, monthly, or maybe weekly, monthly, to discuss a book that you have been reading together. The books that have been so formative in my life are often read in a book club with just 2 or 3 others. Read theology, read spirituality together, read fiction together in your book club, along with social and cultural commentary. Don't forget that fiction plays a key role in cultivating our capacity for compassionate thinking. I realize that Miriam Toews perhaps has put some distance between herself and her Mennonite heritage, but there's no avoiding her sheer genius. She's a towering genius. Coming out of Manitoba to have this kind of strength as a Canadian a novelist, what she did in one of her novels is help me understand, because it's just so foreign to me, why anybody would want to take her life. Why would anybody want to take their life? I just can't imagine it. But it was reading Miriam Toews that helped me get into the shoes of somebody who might want to take their lives. That is, it fosters the capacity for compassionate thinking. And I think back to last summer, I decided that part of my pandemic reading would be to go back to the Russian novelist and to reread Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. Published in the 19th century, I come out of it again thinking, has there ever been a more powerful depiction of the huge tension between fathers and sons? And it just kind of opens up my own appreciation of my relationship with my father, with my grandfathers, with my sons, and with their sons. Reading Karamazov just helps me to see, and I use this next word advisedly, feel the force of the connection intellectually and emotionally. Novelists do this. Read voices that emerge from the global South, from the global South and from religious traditions other than your own. As was mentioned, I have a book coming out this summer on the Holy Spirit, published with IV Press. Part of my agenda with that publication was to lean into the very best of our evangelical theological and spiritual tradition, but also to affirm contemporary voices from Latin America, from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, evangelicals in their sensibilities who are writing on the Holy Spirit that we need to hear, I'm saying. We need to hear these voices. And if anything, I want to say, read Kirsten Kim, speaking out of Korea, as perhaps the most powerful voice from the global South on pneumatology. That is on this topic, but I'm just saying that's just one topic where it seems to me we need to lean into the voices from the global South. And the other book that was mentioned is Wisdom from Babylon that I published last summer. A whole section of that book is making the case that for Christians who live in a post-Christian secular society in Canada, we need to be leaning into the voices from historic minority perspectives. These voices need to shape our understanding of what it means to be the church in a post-Christian secular society. But also, may I commend to you, reading religious voices other than Christian. That is, religious traditions other than your own. That is, I have found huge value in reading Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, especially his calling to mindfulness, especially his calling to simplicity in the work of our hands. And yes, he's a Buddhist, but he calls out something that my own tradition affirms, but rather than demonizing him, actually realizing that he may well be a source of wisdom to me. And then, of course, to read other traditions other than my own. I have found huge value in reading Orthodox, Catholic, and Calvinist traditions that are not my own, but I draw wisdom from them because they shape, form, and inform my understanding and challenge some of the limitations of my own tradition. Also, whatever your vocation or calling, to read the thought leaders within your field. That is, let me challenge you as a pastor, that you have some sense of who's thinking theologically about business, medicine, and law, the arts. And that if you've got artists, business people, doctors in your congregation, that you're encouraging them to read the best thought leaders within those disciplines or those professions. You're familiar with good books on the theology of the arts that you can put in the hands of an artist, good books on the theology of practice of business that you can put in the hands of a Christian business person to cultivate their capacity to think not secularly, but Christianly about the work to which they're called. Read poetry. Get to know some of the best older poets and some contemporary poets who are able to capture your imagination and make sense of what is happening to you intellectually and emotionally. When I say read poets, essentially what I think we're doing is equipping ourselves to read the Psalms of the Old Testament that are the giant articulation of the integration of head and heart. But when I don't quite get what I'm feeling, what I find hugely valuable is to read both the Psalms, of course, but to read contemporary and ancient poets who help me make sense, I use that phrase intentionally, about what's happening to me emotionally. Because if I do not, what's happening to me emotionally will co-opt and undercut my capacity to think clearly. What the poets do is help me capture the deep longings, yearnings, and desires of my own heart, including my propensity towards anger or fear or discouragement. And finally, when I speak about reading, it is important to recognize that much of our reading and our learning will take place online and on a screen. I don't doubt the value of online, of the digital world. Now, this is Saturday. My typical Saturday begins with the New York Times. And it's not that the Saturday edition of the New York Times arrived in my post box just outside of my door. Not a chance. I'm online. So don't, just be aware that what I'm about to say, it's not that I'm dismissing digital reading, but we do need to be wise on that score. That is, we need to realize that there are voices out there that are suggesting to us that deep reading, where the leisured, careful, and ultimately transformative reading may well need to be hard copy text in our hands. That our brains engage the digital world differently from the printed text or the printed world. And that conversation is ongoing. I'm just highlighting it, not wanting for a moment to dismiss either. I'm just saying I do both, but there's something about deep reading, as it's put, leisured, careful, transformative reading that cannot be replaced by the digital world. So where does this leave us? Surely I trust what I'm inviting you to is that when we think about our lives, our work, our ministries, that we are resolved to think theologically about our lives, our work, and our ministries. That we don't view the word theology as somehow elitist or purely academic, but that we are actually asking, who are the thought leaders in our world, and how can we lean into them, and in so doing, allow them to be our teachers, to shape, form, and inform our capacity to do our work in a way that brings glory to God and a way that is deeply consistent with our Christian faith. That if you are an artist or a business person or a school teacher or a civic leader, you are very intentionally cultivating the life of the mind so that you can do your work with theological integrity. And I think I want to end with this, that all of this leads to this end, the resolve that the older we get, the wiser we will become. The older we get, the wiser we will become. That quite apart from what is our work, our profession, our calling, that the older we get, we resolve together, I say to you, my sisters and brothers, that we will not be old fools, that we will grow in wisdom, and that our sons and their generation, our daughters and their generation, our grandchildren will look to us in our senior years as women and men of wisdom. And as Bruce Waltke points out, you do not become wise unless you are knowledgeable, and you're not knowledgeable unless you are taught. So that wisdom is the fruit of knowledge, which is the fruit of teaching. So therefore, the church is a teaching learning community, and a university and a college is but a fostering the capacity of the church to be a teaching learning community, to this end, that we would grow in wisdom. Daryl, I'll conclude my comments there. I was looking for an amen, but I know that Mennonites are very, mellow, subdued. They're not Pentecostals, and so I don't get an amen, but it is what it is. But anyways, I would welcome any comments, questions, observations that anybody who's attending would like to raise. And it doesn't need to be just a Q&A. If you've got a comment you'd like to make to either challenge or reinforce what I've said, nuance it differently, I would welcome that. Or if a question that you'd like to raise with me, or something I said that offended you that I should apologize for, any of the above would be fine.
Thank you, Gordon. You've given us an awful lot to think about. I've already got 3.5 pages in notes, and that's not even close to what you all said. And so, but I greatly appreciate it. Just so you know, I can assure you that the backdrop I have behind me is actually real. So unfortunately, I will not say that I have read all those books.
Real books. So
yeah, they're real books.
Is waving a book at us. Okay, so you're not in the Trinity Library. Okay.
Yeah, no. Yeah. But no, thank you very much. So I invite people to, certainly you can open your microphone now so that you can speak. You can ask your question verbally. If you want to put it in the public chat feature there on the side, you're welcome to do that. And then I will read the question. And again, like Gordon said, certainly you can comment on that. I mean, I go ahead.
I would just like people to identify where they are, who they are when they give their question or comment or observation.
Very good. I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, just so you know, I'm in Steinbach. I'm a pastor of Terry Hebert's church. So I think you've met Terry a few times.
Oh,
so
well, Terry's his wife. What's her name? Laura? No, Laura.
Luann.
She's a poet. She's a poet, and I have. Oh, it's just outside of my reach here. I have her book of poetry that Terry sent to me because there it is. That's right, Jeff. Thanks. Terry was very kind, but when I gave my list of the reading we would do, I left off poetry. So part of my penance was to speak to you people and include poetry. So once I have finished this talk and mentioned poetry, all of my sins are forgiven and I will not go to purgatory. There you go.
Awesome. I do have one question. Maybe I can lead off. Certainly when you spoke of the kinds of books we should read, you covered a wide range. Where does audio visual fit in that? You certainly covered novels and so on. Do you believe that watching good movies can actually help in training your mind?
Two things there. One is my wife is a very she has about half a dozen podcasts that she follows weekly. She's a huge believer in podcasts. And if she was listening to this, I'd be getting grief from her. I'll say something. Well, my time was up, or this fella, Daryl, kept waving at me to stop. So I wasn't able to mention podcasts. But no, she would be big on podcasts. And just recently was signaling an older one from a couple of years ago by Malcolm Gladwell that she's urging me to listen to the next time I'm driving in my car. But Joel and I right now are watching a series called Chosen, a series of biblical films on the life of Jesus, and Peter is a key player. They're brilliant. And last night we watched the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. And I have preached John 4 a half a dozen times in my life, but I'm not going to preach it the same next time. That encounter portrayed that way opened up my eyes to something else in that encounter that I had not seen before. So when I mentioned the arts earlier, I should have mentioned not just music, theater, dance, and of course the dance is square dancing. I keep reassuring my mother that we do theater, music, and dance at Ambrose University, and it's square dancing, Mom, relax. But it's not just theater and drama, but also film. Those are actors. So to put it under the category of drama is, I think, very apt and very appropriate. So yes, thanks, Daryl, for highlighting that as well.
Yeah, I kind of guessed that based on the fact that you included the things you did. Because I know certainly, I'm just like you. I mean, I haven't watched the Chosen series. I've had people in my church really urging me to, because they've told me how powerful it is, and I just haven't taken the time yet. But I have seen depictions. I mean, even simple movies like the movie Up. I mean, it's a kids movie, right? But powerful depiction of, at the very beginning, of lifelong, a couple living together all their lives, and the beauty of it. That just short little clip is incredibly powerful on what it means to have a lifelong commitment of love. It conveys it in a different way.
I needed the film Awakened to understand my father's dementia. I don't think any book I have read would have helped me to understand that. A film helped me to understand it. And again, it goes back to the capacity for compassion. Last year, Joelle and I watched the Netflix series Shtetl on, which is a Hasidic Jewish community. My goodness, that's a huge community in Israel and New York City, in Brooklyn, but way out of my world. And so how else am I going to get into that community? I could read about it. Yes, and I do read about it. But wow, to walk right in, to have that production. And then two recent films, one on a Palestinian couple, a father and his daughter going to buy a refrigerator, and it's a short. And the other one, a black man stepping out and running into a police officer outside of his home. And I realized the white privilege I have, I step out, it doesn't matter what race the police officer is, I know I'm safe. And this black man, his immediate feelings of a threat, he's done nothing wrong, and I don't think I could feel that, understand it. And it's an intellectual thing, but the compassion, like you said, film. Yes. Thank you, Daryl, for mentioning that.
Okay. Someone else. I have more, but I'd love to hear your other questions. So please, respond either text-wise or, encourage you to put your camera on if you can, and your microphone, and ask.
Hi, Gordon. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I'm looking for...
Jeff Cron from Altona here.
Okay.
Yeah, I attend the Altona EMMC. I really appreciate what you said, but the aspect of reading broadly, I've really enjoyed from a lot of different types and styles. A couple of secular authors and presenters I've enjoyed, like Simon Sinek, Jordan Peterson, just diving into their worlds a little bit and seeing how they see things and where they've come from has helped to understand a little bit better, how to converse with people. How do they think? How do I think? And so hearing you say some of those things about where you like your willingness to read from other areas, that really encourages me. It's like you bring your own perspective to these things, but listening to this other person, just trying to dive into their world, helps to broaden my perspective. But I do have a question. What tips would you have for when you're reading other authors, how you glean from them, or what do you look for, or what kind of perspective should you take away from it?
A fair question, and I have a friend, if he was listening in right now, would laugh. See, Gordon, you should read Jordan Peterson, because I have drawn a fence around myself to protect myself, but so I chuckle a little bit at that. I use the following rule of thumb when I'm reading, not so much fiction and poetry, because you engage it differently, and film, but especially when you read nonfiction, that you should be asking, that it's helpful, to ask two questions. And if you're part of a study discussion group, these are the two questions that you might bring to the table. One is, what has been for you a light bulb, an insight, a good reminder, a new learning? That is to be attentive to what that new learning might be. Oftentimes it's the main point that the author's trying to make, and you say, yeah, well, good point. But sometimes it's made along the way. And so even now, you just listened to a talk. If there's one new learning insight that Smith and it may not be new to you, just, oh, I need to remember that. Thank you, Mr. Smith, for reminding me. But what is a new insight, new learning, or reminder? So I use the image of the light bulb that went off. And then secondly, what furrowed your brow? And by furrowed your brow, it may be a disagreement. I just say, you know what? He's a Calvinist, so he's wrong. And they can't help themselves, these dear people, they can't help themselves. But they may be wrong, but the other possibility is it raises a question. Yes, but. So sometimes the two can go together. That's a good point. I agree, that's a light bulb. But what does that mean for what it means to be the church, or what it means to do business, or what it means for? So sometimes it's a point of disagreement, and sometimes it's a point of question. And what that does is cultivate the capacity for critical engagement rather than gullible. This is what's good. Yes, I affirm. This is what's raised the question. But students in universities and seminaries, they love to say, here's where I agree with the author, here's where I disagree. No, you don't have to disagree all the time. It just creates an adversarial posture. When I may agree with the author, but it still furrows my brow. So, Leslie Newbegin can hardly do anything wrong for me. I just think everything he writes is just so spot on. But he still furrows my brow when I begin to realize he wrote 30 years ago. What does that mean now? And with Jacques Ellul, for example, I think he was way too negative on the city. But I don't dismiss him because of that. I just recognize that limitation, for me at least, in his writing. So those are the two questions that I routinely ask. What's the new learning, and what's furrowing my brow?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay, who's next?
Gordon, when you mentioned the being taught.
Well, first, Sam, where are you?
I'm sorry. Oh, yes, Sam. I'm in New Bothwell, Manitoba. Somebody said the Promised Land, I think. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, we're in New Bothwell, just south of Winnipeg here. And my name's Sam Dirksen. I was just wondering, this thing with being taught and then going to knowledge and to wisdom. Historically, I would say that the knowledge and the wisdom have been separated, and we say that you can either have knowledge or wisdom. Have you? How do you then, if people come and they are a little skeptical, how do you convince them that, hey, you know what? Actually, there's more to it than this.
So yeah, I'll unapologetically here lean into Bruce Waltke. I can picture him on this score. I did. Years ago, I did a course with him at what was then Ontario Theological Seminary. I was pastoring in Peterborough and commuting down to OTS to take courses, and took a summer course with Bruce Waltke. And I can picture him in the room when he said, when you read the Old Testament, especially the book of Proverbs, there is no wisdom without knowledge. The thing is, you can have knowledge without wisdom, but you can't have wisdom without knowledge. So he refuses to bifurcate between them. It's not that more knowledge leads to more wisdom, but you just can't have wisdom without knowledge. And he said the same thing about teaching. You can't have knowledge without teaching. So his sequence, teaching leads to knowledge, leads to wisdom, but not necessarily. The reverse is not the case. You can have teaching with no knowledge. And you think, and we've all had them. Presumably teaching's happening, but there's no informed understanding here. And you can have knowledge without wisdom. And all of us know people who are knowledgeable, but are not wise. Just because you have a degree, again, a PhD, for goodness sakes, you're informed does not mean that you're wise. It's just that Waltke insists the reverse is not the case. You cannot have knowledge without teaching. You cannot have wisdom without knowledge. And so Jesus was a teacher, and he was an informed teacher. And he was cultivating an informed understanding of the ancient law and, of course, of the works of God. So that's why the church, is a teaching, learning community that wants to. One of the things that I'm perplexed by is the level to which young people, and we're in that zone right now. We're recruiting young people to come to Ambrose University this fall. How many of them come out of our churches and aren't biblically literate? That the lack of biblical literacy in a typical evangelical young person graduating from high school I wouldn't say it's a source of alarm to me, but it's a furrow brow to me, because I think if you're going to be wise, you're going to know the scriptures. We all know people who know the Bible and are not wise, but you can't be wise without knowing the Bible, just to use that as one example. So biblical literacy is an imperative to the capacity for wisdom.
Thank you.
Who's next? We've got another 5 or so minutes. It'd be great if we had another question.
Or comment, or observation, or gentle critique. Gentle, I'm in my mid-60s, and so it's a vulnerable time in a man's life, so be gentle. No, I welcome the pushback, because I'm wanting to strengthen this perspective. Yeah, go ahead, Daryl.
I certainly resonate with you in terms of our faith tradition as well, of being quite suspicious of higher learning. And it was tended to be Evangelical Mennonite Mission Conference tended to be very pragmatic, didn't come from a background of higher education. And so even within myself, there has been this suspicion of higher learning. And I think, are there dangers? Of course there is. You can get led down all kinds of garden paths, absolutely. But the idea of learning to think critically is huge.
Well, look what just happened. When I first got this invitation, I was asked to speak at a mission conference on the life of the mind. No. What are you doing, people? It was just this like, wow, sure, you bet I'll take it. But for me, it was deeply encouraging, because it really, frankly, I'm an ordained minister with the Christian and Missionary Alliance. You probably know that tribe. We're just down the street from you. I can't imagine it happening that within my own denomination, if we had a conference on global Christian mission, both local and domestic and international, that we would have a session or a workshop on the life of the mind, to which, and I'm looking down at the bottom, 20 people would come. I can't see it happening. So just to say, I'm heartened and encouraged that it's even happening, that we're having this conversation about this. And I think what it needs to ultimately lead to is that we're thinking theologically and critically about our approaches to engaging our society. For example, what does it mean to engage a post-Christian secular society? We need to be thoughtful, theologically informed to do that. We need to draw on the best wisdom we can get to do that. And the same principle applies for global mission as well. Can we approach this in a not merely instrumentalist, pragmatic way in terms of how many people we can get across the line, but in a way that is theologically informed and thoughtful?
Have you found success? I don't like the word success all that much, but especially in terms of our secular society, working with non-believers, a thinking way of engaging them where they come to faith, where they begin to realize the depth of Christianity that they would never have imagined. Have you experienced that in any way?
Yeah, without doubt. I think I'm not convinced of the rational apologetic as the way to get people into the kingdom. So maybe I need to state that up front. So even though I'm speaking on the Christian mind, I'm not persuaded about a rationalist apologetic. So I'm trying to look at the level of gray hair in the room, but people don't have their cameras on, so I don't know how old they are. But for those of you that are my peer, well, some of you don't have hair at all, so it doesn't help at all. But anyways, for those of you that are my generation, you would get this, that when I was a university student at U of R, University of Regina in the 1970s, we would read Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And we were convinced that if you just had the 3 evidences for the resurrection, you become a Christian. In fact, you don't even have to read the book. We just hit you with it. And that mindset that did not engage the deep aspirations and longings of our society. So the contrast would be, I mean, I appreciate the way N.T. Wright is talking about what do people long for? What do they aspire for? And that deep longing needs to be the point of connection. And so I insist that evangelism in a post-Christian secular society, we need to listen twice as much as we speak. We need to get past the kind of formulaic approach to evangelism that says, that it presumes that we have the questions. You know, the classic, what would you say to St. Peter if you were trying to get into the kingdom? That's not a question they're asking. So what are the questions? What are the longings? What are the aspirations? And therefore, we need to understand, in my opinion, we are now in a post-Christian secular society. What does it mean to be in a secular society? What does it mean to have people walk in behind us when we're having a Zoom call and just assume that this is just ordinary things that are done? Well, what does in our society? These things happen now. And so we need to be ready and alert for that possibility. But I mentioned earlier Thich Nhat Hanh. What Thich Nhat Hanh has done for me is help me understand the number of young people who are attracted to Buddhism. And I'm wondering why. What is the appeal? What is the attraction? G.K. Chesterton spoke about this a century ago. He said that in England, people are attracted to Eastern mystical religions. Why? What is it? Well, Thich Nhat Hanh has helped me to see why. There is this yearning for transcendence. And for whatever reason, the church may not be bridging that gap, but we can. But ironically, we may learn, what is it that is that longing? And a rationalist apologetic just won't. It has no connection. For what it's worth, our society also discounts the life of the mind. So all 3 of those, sentimentalism, pragmatism, and the polarization, that's in our society as well. So it's not just a Christian challenge we have, but it's right within our society.
Okay, we are about 10, 15 seconds away from our session automatically ending. So I want to express my gratitude to Gordon for speaking to us. Thank you so much for joining us. We really greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Well, they just shut us off.
Well, it normally does. And now my computer says 2:15 and it's not shut.